Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is David Patterson. It's my pleasure, my honor to welcome you to this first webinar session in a series. It's the opening of a series that the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy has put together. The series is called The Intersectionality of Anti-Semitism. And this term, intersectionality, has been in use, and certainly in academic circles for some time. But as we see anti-Semitism take on a range of manifestations and interconnections, the intersectionality of anti-Semitism, the name of the series, has become, an all the more pressing issue. And now, given the global pervasiveness of anti-Semitism, given its online presence, related inroads into the mainstream, there may be no greater challenge for scholars of anti-Semitism than to reconsider our assumptions about who the anti-Semites are and where and how they mobilize. So this 12-part series of seminars, there'll be 6 in the fall, 6 in the spring. This series interrogates the identities anti-Semites presumably possess. We look at the ideological positions they prefer, the places they inhabit, with an eye toward anti-Semitism's ideological fluidity, as well as its contradictions and corresponding convergences. We're interested in original, interesting, and emerging areas of anti-Semitism research. So to this end, we invite researchers to present work on a range of topics that include, but not exclusive to, anti-Semitism's convergence with misogyny, racism, heterosexism. We're also interested in the growing convergence between the social movements and/or corporations, including news outlets, whose legitimacy and bottom line are informed by the opposition to our connection with anti-Semitism. So we're interested then in insights that can be gleaned from the comparisons across regions, as well as those that can be had from in-depth attention to country or to site-specific case studies. Today, we are very fortunate to have one of the brilliant scholars in this field to speak today, Dr. Amy Elman, about the mainstreaming of American anti-Semitism, the defeat of an ideal. Dr. Elman is a professor of political science and the William Weber Chair of Social Science at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. She's received numerous awards for her scholarship, including 2 Fulbright grants, a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and a grant from the Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She has worked on behalf of women's rights and against anti-Semitism in the US and within Europe for 3 decades. She has lectured and published widely on the response of states and the European Union on issues of citizenship, migration, violence against women, sex discrimination, and anti-Semitism. She has published 4 books. Her most recent book, titled The European Union, Anti-Semitism and the Politics of Denial. This book explores the conditions that precipitated the EU's efforts to stem anti-Semitism and considers the consequences. I'm very pleased to say that Dr. Elman is a colleague and a friend. She's a fellow ISGAP Senior Research Fellow. I've been blessed to learn from her, and today we will all learn from Dr. Elman. Please welcome her.
Thanks for the kind introduction. And it's a real honor to be involved with you, David, and so many others at ISGAP. So let me just dive right into today's discussion. The discussion is entitled The Mainstreaming of American Anti-Semitism, and the subtitle refers to a book produced by Shirley Hazard, who was writing about the United Nations, and she entitled it Defeat of an Ideal. And I think it's certainly a title that extends to conditions here in the United States as well. I'm going to be making the argument that in order to understand the depths of American anti-Semitism, we're really going to have to dispense with our conventional understandings of that. And this requires a rejection, interestingly enough, of American exceptionalism, in which anti-Semitism happens elsewhere, in other countries throughout the world, in other states here, in other political parties, professions, campuses, and communities, not our own. Anti-Semitism, when it's understood through the lens of American exceptionalism, occurs only to those who are less fortunate than we are. It occurs in places that we seemingly don't inhabit. And this is, I think, deeply wrong. What I'm going to be suggesting is that American anti-Semitism is so pervasive, so utterly mainstream, that it actually happens in plain sight. Take, for instance, the Charlottesville 2017 Unite the Right rally, where commentators proved so inept and or unwilling to recognize anti-Semitism as an ideological linchpin of white nationalism that they misquoted marchers. And so to give you an idea of how they did so, those screaming, "Jews will not replace us," were heard only saying, "You will not replace us," and little else. Consider too the persistent refusal to acknowledge anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that inspired the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, first in 1993, the terror attacks, by the way, that foreshadowed what we see to the right of the screen. They foreshadowed 9/11. That the mastermind of that first World Trade Center attack initially planned to bomb Jewish neighborhoods in Brooklyn and decided to bomb the Manhattan landmark only after thinking that most World Trade Center workers were Jewish is significant. The hijackers who later murdered nearly 3,000 at the World Trade Center on 9/11 were similarly deluded. They believed in and endeavored to end a Jewish worldwide conspiracy, and by extension, the Jewish state and America's support of it. When specifically asked about the central purpose of that terror, Osama bin Laden replied, and I quote, "To force America to end its support of Israel." His unambiguously stated aim to destroy the Jewish state was inextricable from his contempt for the United States, which is home to the largest Jewish diaspora. That neither the towers, World Trade Center towers, nor all those who worked within them were Jewish matters less than the ways in which those who targeted them thought they were. Those eager to dismiss bin Laden and his followers as simply deranged will continue to fail to grasp just how mainstream their aspirations have become. Within 2 decades, Israel has become a wedge issue and a veritable third rail of not just American politics, but American culture and campus life. References to the massacre of 11 in Pittsburgh as the deadliest attack on American Jews in US history further conceals, however unintentionally, anti-Semitism's centrality to the thousands murdered by jihadists on 9/11, and it mistakenly attributes the highest number of casualties to white supremacists instead. My intention is not to engage in an ideologically driven competition about who is more murderously anti-Semitic. But it is instead to understand anti-Semitism's mainstream appeal and its ideological promiscuity. In addition to being swivel-headed, let us consider, my point is, instead of always, we're told to stop being that we've got to be swivel-headed. We've got to look to the left and the right. And one of the things that I want to do today is focus on the degree to which we don't always have to go left or right. We can actually focus on the convergences, the kind of intersections where anti-Semites converge. And there are three of them that I'm going to be focused on today. One of them is Great Replacement theory. The second one is dual loyalty tropes. And the third one is Holocaust, inversion, and denial. So those are the first three. I'm going to begin with Great Replacement conspiracists who are actually promoting Jewish replacement. So Trump's 2016 ascent understandably extended great interest in the former president's alt-right base and the conspiracies to which so many of them subscribe. With the torches, Nazi-inflicted shrieks of blood and soil, and the chant that I mentioned earlier, Jews will not replace us, the Charlottesville rally introduced Great Replacement conspiracy to the greater public. And what we miss out oftentimes is the way in which, in doing that, the organizers achieved their chief ambition, which was to promote Great Replacement theory. It posits that Jews are the masterminds of Aryan replacement through ominous multiculturalism and integration. And they insist that Jews manipulate Gentile immigrants and people of color precisely because, they insist, neither group is capable of organizing itself. Galvanized by the prospect that Jews facilitate non-white and Muslim migration to deprive so-called white Americans of their life's portion, Great Replacement conspiracists actually helped foment the kind of lethal violence that we saw not only in Charlottesville, but later in Pittsburgh, where you'll recall that the Pittsburgh shooter was widely quoted for stating online that Jews, quote, bring invaders in that kill our people. Less noted by those who often quote him are the parallels between the far right nationalists who demand America's Jews leave for Israel and the far right globalists and Islamicists who demand that Jews leave from Israel in chants like free Palestine, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The geography and the slogans differ, but the conspiracy-fueled bids for Jewish removal is actually quite similar. And in one of the other slides that I was going to show you is that weeks before the shooter insisted that there's no Make America Great Again, as long as there's a, quote, kike infestation, it was Louis Farrakhan who tweeted, and I would have put this online so that you can see it. He tweets, "I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm anti-termite." What's interesting is that earlier he was suspended for posing, and I quote the following: "The satanic Jew has deceived the whole world." And this is a claim that is also made by congressional members, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who I had pictured in front of the 2021 Democratic Socialists of American Convention, at which the Michigan Congresswoman invited her audience to, quote, look behind the curtain to find the same people who make money off of racism. Then what she does is she taps into the inflammatory accusation that Jews are a deceitful enemy who profit from the world's downtrodden. She stated the same people exploit Palestinians in Gaza and African Americans in Detroit. This position is now streaming on Netflix through Dave Chappelle's controversial comedy, The Closer. And then I was going to share another slide that talks about how he depicts Jews as those who subject others to the atrocities that they themselves have been subjected, which, Leslie Claff has been very good at demonstrating how that's a Holocaust version. What Chappelle then does is he states the following, quote, "It's mind-blowing, and shockingly, they're making a movie." And his punchline was, ironically, it's called Space Jews. I wondered when I was watching him if he was somehow channeling Congresswoman from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a QAnon follower who claimed that Jewish space lasers were behind California's wildfires in 2018. But the fact is, no, according to his skit, he was just watching UFO videos during COVID quarantine, and he imagined a movie in which, get this, aliens from Earth's ancient civilizations return because, and I quote, "things go terrible for them on the other planet, and they decide they want to claim the Earth for their very own." It's rather derivative, and it's a cribbed plot line with few subtleties. That is to say, the implications that Jews are not fully human, wrongfully occupy Israel, and want the Earth for themselves reiterates the anti-Semitic canards that are found in the Protocols of Zion, Nazi propaganda, and more recently, the Hamas Charter. Now, it's often suggested that anti-Semites like Chappelle and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and the list goes on, are the visible exemplars of a new cultural and political elite who are undermining America's exceptionalism. In other words, America's enduring norms of tolerance and basic civility. But I wanted us to take a second look. And so I had a slide in which you would see snapshots from just as recently as the 1990s, in which you'll see former Secretary of State James Baker and conservative gadfly Pat Buchanan complicate those cliched portraits that we're told to embrace about a gentler past. Because it's Baker who allegedly remarked, "F the Jews, they don't vote for us anyway." And it's Buchanan, Pat Buchanan, a conservative guy, who referred to Capitol Hill as Israeli occupied territory. Because these comments came from well-heeled pre-Trump establishment right figures and could have just as easily emanated from today's so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party, I wanted us to re-examine the utility of antiquated political designations. While anti-Semitism's left-leaning analysts have adopted the dual loyalty canards once associated with those right-wing elders, more shocking perhaps are prominent liberal Jews who also indulge in the tired accusation that America's Jews are more loyal to the Jewish state than they are to their compatriots, and that they do this under the pretext of fighting anti-Semitism is especially disturbing. And so I had another slide in which I introduced you to Jonathan Weissman, who was a former Washington editor for the New York Times, whose 2018 book entitled Semitism, being Jewish in the age of Trump, focuses only on the alt-right, but it contains the following passage, and I think it's quite telling. He writes, "The American Jewish obsession with Israel has taken our eyes off not only the politics of our own country, the growing gulf between rich and poor, and the rising tide of nationalism, but also our own grounding in faith." It's quite rich coming from Weissman. This jaundiced view of American Jewry in relation to Israel is so pronounced that it reverberates with some regularity across the political spectrum. And so I had a slide showing you a 2014 tweet from the Arab activist Linda Sarsour, it reads, Israel should give citizenship to U.S. politicians who are more loyal, to Israel than they are to the American people. And it's quite notable that I then have a copy of a tweet that emanates from David Duke, the neo-Nazi. So he retweets Sasor's tweet with, what's the saying about a broken clock? In other words, even Linda Sarsour could be right twice a day. So this goes back and forth across the political spectrum. By 2019, the dual loyalty trope has gained such prominence that you have congressional members like Rashida Tlaib, who identifies as Palestinian, insisting that other congressional members who are opposed to the boycott of Israel, and this is a quote from her, forgot which country they represent. Now, this is an accusation that's so repugnant that I think that had similar statement been issued against her, it would have been rightly denounced as racist. In fact, when Trump tweeted that Tlaib and her colleague from Minnesota, Ilhan Omar, the first Somali American and the first naturalized citizen of African birth to serve in Congress should, quote, go back to the places from which they came, the response was as rapid as it was unequivocal. In other words, within days, what we saw was the House of Representatives voting strongly to condemn the president's racist comments, and the social media hashtag, I stand with Ilhan Omar, was trending not only in the United States, but internationally. German Chancellor Angela Merkel weighed in against then President Trump to express her solidarity with Omar. This is quite unusual. Heads of state now are battling on social media. That few, by contrast, expressly condemned dual loyalty accusations testifies to anti-Semitism's virulence and its enduring tropes within the United States and well beyond. And these include, but are far from limited to, notions that Jews degrade the places they inhabit, going back to Chappelle, that they're immensely powerful, disloyal, deceitful, and greedy. And then I want to get to the third trope, which is this, that Jews not only exploit oppressed people, but they also exploit their own oppression, including the Holocaust. So the next slide would have read, Holocaust appropriation is all lives matter. Had the undisguised anti-Semitism of jihadists been forcefully acknowledged and condemned by journalists, as well as a 9/11 Commission report in particular, I think that we might have avoided a House Foreign Affairs Committee that 2 decades later continued the disturbing trend of downplaying anti-Semitism's relevance by issuing an official statement on the Holocaust without reference to the bigotry that was foundational to it. And so then I have a tweet from the House Foreign Affairs Committee that reads, on Yom HaShoah, we commit ourselves to remembering the 6 million lives extinguished during the Holocaust and the millions more who survived its cruelty. To honor their memories, we must remain vigilant against the forces of prejudice and injustice, or risk reliving the horrors of the past. So that statement is seemingly innocuous, but it actually erases Jews as the murdered 6 million, and it substitutes vague references to prejudice and injustice for anti-Semitism's inextricability from the Holocaust. And so what we have is a Democratic-led committee withdrawing the genocide of Jews from a catalog of Nazi infamy on Holocaust Remembrance Day, all under the guise of honoring the extinguished and remembering the horrors of the past. Congressional members then extended an ironic victory to the perpetrators of Jewish genocide, regardless of whatever their intent was. And I want to speak to the intent because the next day, by marked contrast, that same committee issued a formal press release that explicitly recognized the over 4,000 Roma murdered by the Nazis as part of International Roma Day. So what this demonstrates to me is the legislators demonstrated that they do have the capacity, should they so choose, to avoid an all lives matter approach and instead issue appropriate pronouncements concerning Nazi crimes. The dearth of critical news coverage extended to the committee's tweet is especially troubling, and it marks a significant departure from the press's treatment of Trump when in 2017, he became the first president of the United States to omit mention of the Nazi extermination of Europe's Jews in a commemorative Holocaust statement. And in its handling of Trump's omission, the Washington Post provided commentary from prominent Jewish leaders faulting the president. The following year, the editorial board of the New York Times insisted Trump, quote, atone for his previous disregard of Jews. And the New York Times rightly reasoned that in leaving out any specific reference to 6 million Jews murdered by Nazis, his administration had expunged Hitler's greatest victims from the record. Yet, in selecting to ignore the Democratic-led committee's no less troubling tweet, both newspapers and countless others endorsed the anti-Semitism that they earlier claimed to oppose when it came from the right. This and other manifestations of the media's hypocrisy highlight the partisan character of anti-Semitism that fuels the public's mistrust of the Fourth Estate. And with state credibility so diminished and the Holocaust so politicized, we even have anti-vaxxers posing as victims of totalitarianism with swastikas comprised of syringes. And that was another post that I wanted to share with you. So the question, the second to last slide, asks essentially, where do we go from here? Especially as anti-Semitism can seem a Sisyphean task, and Jews are not Greeks, so forget Sisyphus. But while we've not so far covered the distressing, survey and crime data, I'm sure that most of us are aware that in the United States, Jews are the top target of religious-based hate crimes every year since 1991, when the FBI began this kind of reporting. So this alone should train our eyes on how best to counter the convergences that we've covered. In New York City, where Jews were the victims of half of all hate crimes, the ADL in 2019 noted that the perpetrators were neither jihadists, nor were they far-right extremists, but they were young African-American men. That most of the victims were Orthodox may have also dulled the awareness, if not outrage, of more secular Jews and their ostensibly progressive allies. If what I'm saying seems true to you at all, again, that the fact that most of the perpetrators were African-American and most of the victims were Orthodox, if what I'm saying seems true to you at all about the dulled outrage, I want to make it clear that that's in keeping with exactly the kind of American exceptionalism that I think that we have to reject. In other words, we can't dismiss anti-Semitism because it's done by some people and not others, or done to others and not ourselves. It doesn't work that way. For decades, both the Nation of Islam and white nationalists have shared the racist view that Jews and not African Americans have controlled the civil rights movement. And this placed Jews in what Barry Weiss refers to as a double bind. While white supremacists insist Jews are not white, self-proclaimed progressives regard most Jews as white oppressors who neither need nor deserve the protection they insist must be available to other victims of racism. And these increasingly common views do not bode well for America's Jews, for our future, especially those more observant Jews who have consistently contended with Jew-baiting harassment, voiced long before Trump's ascent or the Pittsburgh massacre. Indeed, it was the more visible community, these more visible Orthodox communities that obsessed those who targeted the World Trade Center in 1993 and later 9/11, the deadliest attack on Jews in US history. To recognize that anti-Semitism has since gone mainstream is to witness its diverse and inclusive appeal, such that it's sometimes expressed as well by Jews and others who claim to oppose it. Anti-Semitism, again, hides in plain sight, and so too must our efforts to end it. So I'll just stop there because I'm kind of opposed to offering glib recommendations for what we can do. I would just say that I think it's especially critical for Jews to come out unapologetically as Jewish, and it's also important for non-Jews to support Jews who do so. So I did have a humorous slide at the end about the Jewish space laser corps, but you'd have to see it to believe it. So I'll just end there, and I'm sorry that my slide didn't work and my slideshow didn't work, and we'll gladly get that to you.
Thank you, Dr. Elman. That was incredible, eye-opening, insightful. We do have a question from one of the participants. Dan Ben-Ami has his hand up. Dan, can you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm dialing in from Britain across the Atlantic, so I'm observing the US from a distance. But I just wondered what you meant when you used the term mainstreaming of anti-Semitism. So in other words, do you think that it's anti-Semitism is prevalent across Main Street America? So just to emphasize, I completely recognize what you said about the evils of jihadism and the far right, and also that there are problems on elements of the left of anti-Semitism. I completely recognize that. I'm not disputing that for one moment, but mainstreaming is a very strong word. And to me, it suggests that the ordinary American in somewhere in middle America also holds to anti-Semitic views. I mean, is that something that you're arguing, or do you take a different view? I'd really welcome your take on that.
I appreciate your careful attention to my presentation. When I'm saying mainstreaming, it's not necessarily the case that everyone is anti-Semitic. It is the case that anti-Semitism is being mainstreamed in all of the ways in which we're expected to view politics. And that's the approach. The fact that it's now okay to issue the kinds of comments that are emanating from our Congress, and so few people seem willing to challenge it, that's what I mean by mainstream. The fact that you can not only watch Dave Chappelle, but the criticisms of Dave Chappelle are so circumscribed that hardly anyone except a few Jewish outlets seem to have even noticed that what he was saying was completely anti-Semitic. I would say it's similar to the argument for, by that great book that just came out on your side of the pond called Jews Don't Count. And if we're living in a world in which Jews don't count, that's what so many of us mean by mainstreaming. I'm hoping that helps a bit.
Other questions, comments? Yes, let's see.
Corinne and Ellen have their hands up.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
Well, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Amy,
Corinne,
thank you.
yes.
Amy, thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. I'd like to do a follow-up comment on the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism to which you refer. Recently, for the volume in which you contributed, Poisoning the Wells, Anti-Semitism in Contemporary America, I did, with Joel Finkelstein, a chapter on Holocaust denial, the future of on the web, the future of anti-Semitism on the web. And we looked at, and of course, as you know, there's a 2-year lag period, at least for when you publish an article. In this case, it was 3 years. And we were looking at who was doing Holocaust denial on the web was principally at that time, white nationalists and Islamicists. And since that time, it has been increasingly, it's spreading very rapidly, and it's taking advantage of international events to sort of glom onto things the way that anti-Semitism does. And it's now the radical left, Black Lives Matter, white nationalists, and Islamists who are doing it. So it's Holocaust denial, which is seen as sort of, you know, off the map, is no longer off the map. It's being mainstreamed within organizations. So I just want to open up a comment, and, you know, the idea that anti-Semitism is spreading throughout various sectors and is being picked up and, in that sense, mainstream, even the most extreme versions of it.
I think that the point's well taken. And also, to the extent to which we don't even see it anymore. That's what I find incredible, that we don't see it anymore, that we don't see that it's actually anti-Semitism that precludes an analysis of the centrality of the jihadism and the anti-Semitism of 9/11. That we refer wrongly to Pittsburgh. The vice president just did this last week in welcoming the the ADL conference against anti-Semitism. Listen to this: anti-Semitism and hate. So these are the moments when you know that you have a huge problem.
Yeah. Ellen, you have a hand up?
Thank you very much. Amy, thank you so much for your clear and articulate and just wonderful presentation to us. One of the things that I found very interesting as a political scientist is that your examples were things that we could visually see and hear. And I'd like to also mention that the normalization of our invisibility, of our hatred, is also produced by the silence that is more than in the political process. For example, what is very clear to Jews is that when we say the word anti-Semitism, we're talking about a hatred particular and explicitly for Jews, towards Jews of our existence. And what we are finding is that, take in our courses at all our universities, when you Google the extent to which pedagogy is including anti-Semitism as a major course or as a major module, you will find a sparsity that is very, very upsetting. And when you check how they define anti-Semitism, most often it is as a form of racism, excluding our particularity as Jews. And then we also find that the knowledge of Jews centers on the Holocaust as opposed to the huge history of the events that constitute the longest hatred. It's in an ahistorical context, merging with the notion that as long as Jews do not suffer as they once did, they are counted among those who have made it, which is translated into being white. And another thing that I would like to show as an example of a silence, in the state of Illinois, as in most states, people who work for the state, which includes me as a professor at a state university, we must take an ethics test. And this year, in the state of Illinois, a harassment module that takes an hour was listed. Every form of racial hatred was listed, and there was no mention of the harassment of Jewish faculty, Jewish students, which is the legitimation of the silence of when we are not counted. And lastly, when we look at the responses of university presidents, a wonderful example would be to the awful situation of Israel being accused as starting the Gaza outbreak of violence and rockets coming toward Israel from the very, very start. What you had when this was confronted by Jewish faculty is what is now called a symbolic response by university administrators who express their sympathy among all forms of hate without defining anti-Semitism as a particularistic exclusion. And these are forms, just like we would learn in political science about non-decision making is a clear decision, so is the silence around our particularism. And I thank you once again for your excellence.
Thank you, Ellen, for all your comments. You're usually so on target. I'm seeing a few questions that came in through the chat board, and I'd like to honor those and speak to them.
You want to go to the, Cheryl Sachs has a question.
Yeah.
Amy, can you see the questions?
Yes, I can now.
Okay, go ahead.
Can you comment on the effect of social media on the rise of anti-Semitism? And do you think the social media companies are sincere in their attempts to limit hate speech? Do you think it's too big for them to monitor? So I'm not an expert on social media per se and the technologies with which they could or could not monitor them. But it's a great question. I will tell you that no, I find social media companies to be utterly disingenuous in their attempts to limit hate speech, utterly disingenuous. And I'll just give you an example. This year, I'd like to think about Google's handling of its former head of global diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is a recent case in which, on the eve of Kristallnacht, a few years earlier, that head of diversity, equity, and inclusion wondered online what he might do if he were a Jew. And he writes, "If I were a Jew, I would be concerned about my insatiable appetite for war, killing in defense of myself." That's what he wrote. This is the head of Google's Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And once he was exposed for this rather standard depiction of Jews as warmongering, he issued an apology to his Jewish coworkers at Google. And in that apology, he explained, quote, what I wrote crudely characterized the entire Jewish community, right? As opposed to, I don't know why you could do another Jewish community, but that's the exceptionalism part. He said it was intended as a critique of a particular military action fed into anti-Semitic tropes and prejudice. I think we can all agree there's no easy solution. But beside that point, the way I expressed my views on that conflict were hurtful. Now, what situation this man has in mind and why he singles out all Jews, and I don't even care if he singles out some of them, isn't entirely any more clear than why he feels obliged to issue that statement, right? His fantasy about if I were a Jew on the eve of Kristallnacht. And more disturbing, and this gets to Cheryl Sachs's question, is why Google, with its motto of don't be evil, merely transferred this employee and did nothing else, speaks to the level of silence, indifference, and the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism. So I hope, Cheryl, I answered your question. Murray Rubin doesn't really have a question, but he says, everyone's not anti-Semitic. Absolutely, Murray. Thank God most of the world are indifferent. Well, indifferent, I wish that more people cared. What Jews need are allies from other groups who face racism. So that's Murray from Toronto. And I do think that we need more allies. Miriam Shankar, how can Jews band together to make this a bipartisan issue? Do you think that's still possible? So, and would Jews be able to make this issue anti-Semitism on which we vote accordingly so that there's a fear of Jewish voting patterns? I think that there's too much fear of Jews. I think that they exaggerate the power that we have. Anyway, I think actually, and this is where I'm somewhat unorthodox, I imagine, I think it's precisely bipartisanship and polarization that is killing us. And I think that I understand wanting to be bipartisan. I think we have to be more, I think we need more than just two parties, because I think both of them are actually miserable for so many of us, not just Jews, and shame on them. So I wouldn't know how to make it bipartisan, really. And that's the truth. Dan, Colin, in a context where white supremacist groups are increasingly seeking direct action and harming racialized communities, is it really worth speaking out about left anti-Semitism, which I recognize is a very real phenomenon, and right-wing anti-Semitism? So here's something, and I can't take credit for this. This was Charles Jacobs, and I listened to a recent podcast that he gave. And so Dan, I'm channeling Charles Jacobs. His point was that one of the reasons that a lot of the right has come out in the way that you're recognizing is harming racialized communities is now they have as cover the notion that they're doing so under the pretext of social justice, which is provided by, he'd be arguing, it's provided by the left. I thought that was a very interesting insight, that the left is now providing for cover to the folks on the far right. And I think that's something that I hadn't really thought about, but might help us to think differently as well about that. And I think I've just gone through all of
Miriam Elman, you have your hand up?
Yes. Hi, Amy.
Yeah,
Thank you for such a terrific presentation. I'm just echoing the chorus and praising you for what you're doing and how you're trying to parse this out, in particular the way in which the left and the right are coming together over hatred of Jews increasingly in very disturbing ways. I've been looking at this too, in particular, as you probably know, in terms of deadly exchange. This campaign, which is now at the center of the anti-Israel movement in the United States, which is a conspiracy theory attempting to link Israel and American Jewish organizations in some sort of nefarious attempt to harm Blacks and other minorities through policing techniques and instruction and exchanges. Now, for years, I and others have been trying to tell people that this is a conspiracy theory and a very dangerous one, with some difficulty in getting through, because it's originated and disseminated by Jews and by Jewish organizations partly. And I think because it's connected to progressive causes, and that scares people or shies people away. But when you could make the clear evidentiary case that the right was using this campaign, David Duke and others was actually using deadly exchange in their materials, suddenly people were willing to start to look at it seriously and to criticize it. And that's good. But actually, it's an example that proves your point, and you might want to use it if you write this up as an article. I hope you do. It proves the point that Jews are invisible, right? And particularly when it comes to left-wing politics, Jews become invisible. And it's only when you can link it somehow to the far right that we become somewhat visible again. So I just shared that and thought it might be, you know, an example, another example that sort of proves what you're trying to explore here.
Thanks. And I mean, it's quite sad. By the time that we seem to notice that there's a problem, it's already accrued such degree of credibility and legitimacy that we lose out in a huge way, huge way.
Amy, well, okay, you have another question from Amalia. Do you see it?
Yes. How influential is J Street in making it okay to be anti-Israel? I know when it started, it provided a platform for anti-Israel, anti-Semites. You know, Amalia, I haven't kept up with J Street, but the second part of your comments speaks volumes. I know that when it started, it provided a platform for anti-Israel, anti-Semites. I think that what might have bothered folks before about J Street is like what Miriam Elman is saying about the deadly exchange, right? At first, some of us seemed to notice what it was doing. Now it's just, probably J Street sounds quaint at this point because it's so mainstream among so many Jews to be so anti-Israel. And I think that this is a form of anti-Semitism that asks Jews not to be Jewish, that essentially demands of us that we have no connection with Israel. And as long as we're willing to do that, then we get to be Jewish. We get to be dhimmis, and this is not acceptable. So I can't say I'm actually aware of what J Street is doing now, but maybe one of our colleagues does.
Well, Amy, let me ask you this with regard to mainstreaming, not among some Jews who want to be viewed as good Jews, right? With regard to Israel and ways in which anti-Zionism is mainstream. It's not only acceptable and fashionable, but what disturbs me, and I'd love your thoughts, is that it becomes morally required. I cannot be considered a good person unless I oppose the existence of the Jewish state, the apartheid state, right? What is morally required with regard to how we deal with an apartheid state? Not apartheid policies, but the state. Right. So this is troubling to me that anti-Semitism in some of its manifestations is, again, not just mainstream, but morally required.
Right.
I mean, maybe I'm overreacting.
No, I don't think so. I think what's going on is if that's required, then Jews are really immoral. That we are profoundly immoral. And also, in a way,
Exactly.
There's nothing there, right? We've been told that that's the religious anti-Semitism from centuries back. So we keep coming full circle. Little of this is new.
That's right. No, and that Jews are immoral. Yes, precisely. And from the standpoint of anti-Semitism, the premise is not that all Jews are evil. No, it's that all evil is Jewish.
That's correct.
So,
I mean, logically, that's correct.
Yeah, so the project of purifying the world requires the purging of the contagion of the Jew, the eternal Jew.
Right.
Right.
And our replacement, right? From the river to the sea, our replacement.
Yes, 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 yes.
Convergence where I began.
Yeah.
We've got 2 more minutes. I don't know if we want to take Joseph Freeman or if others need to wrap up in some way.
Should we take one more question?
Yeah, we can take the last question. So Joseph, if you could just unmute and ask Amy.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was just doing my Hanukkah list for my wife, the gifts, when she's not in the house. As you can hear, I'm an immigrant. I'm originally from United Kingdom. So I have a few comments. My later career was at high school teaching maths in Florida. I think part of the trend is, and I've got, maybe it's becoming just, let me unmute, perhaps you want to see me, I don't know if you do.
Joseph.
Okay, there we are. Okay, so, hey, so maybe it's just, this has become acceptable. What was unacceptable 30 years has now become acceptable. I have just a few comments briefly. Obviously there's critical race theory. I see, like you've explained, from the 4 areas, it's not just from the right, it's not just from the left, people, but I also, I've listened to Dora Horn. I don't know if you're familiar with her.
I adore her.
I have family who died in the Holocaust, so I'm going to say that. But I'm disturbed. I would like to have seen in Washington, D.C., instead of a museum of the Holocaust, history of the Jewish people, showing Jews with a history before, and also, but I hate to touch a nerve, but also reminding how the world, including the United States and the United Kingdom, stabbed the Jewish people in the back when the Jews needed somewhere to go. If you know what I'm talking about, I don't explain further. And then a postscript to the museum would be, the Jews have learned and they have a state again. That's what I would like to see, and that hasn't happened. And I'm disturbed by the amount of museums. I had students saying we're going out to have fun at the Holocaust studies because they were released from class. That's not what our legacy should be of those 12 years of Hitler. I don't know if the atmosphere has changed. I've been here 30 years. I know what's happened in Europe. The atmosphere has changed for the Jewish people, in Britain particularly. I assume for everything you've said that the atmosphere has changed for American Jews. I think I belong to a Reform synagogue. I don't know about Jews who are outside any synagogues, whether they care. I hate to say that. I don't know if younger people care. I don't know. I'm just saying, but for someone who comes from United Kingdom, I'm just going to finish off. 90% of Jews have been to Israel at least once. And I've been there so far 6 times, and I'm planning to go the 7th time next year because of COVID, and I have family there. And most Jews have moved from the Labour Party, which I supported, and most Jews went from the Democrats to the Conservative. Jews seem to have this fixation with the Democrats. I'm talking about the 3/4 who voted. So I'm just going to listen to your comments, and thank you for allowing me to speak.
Well, Joseph, thanks for attending. I just want to do a plug for young folks, okay? I think that many of them have been, I think many of them feel alone. I'll just speak for many of the Jewish students on my campus. I think many of them feel alone. I think that we have neglected I'm speaking for myself now. I think that sometimes we have neglected our responsibility to them in making it very clear that no matter where anti-Semitism emanates, it's not okay. And on most college campuses, that is from people who identify themselves as progressive. So they're having one hell of a time. If I'm hopeful at all, it's because that next generation understands very, very clearly, in ways that it seems that many of us do not, who are older, that this is not a haven for them, that people who claim to be in social movements and deeply concerned about fighting injustice really have excluded Jews as immoral. That itself is immoral. And so I'm looking forward to really supporting young folks in the best way that we possibly can, and learning from them, because they're actually now on the front lines in ways that we're not. So I really thank everybody for being with us today. David, do you want to close up, or Daphne?
I just want to offer a word of thanks to all of the participants to Daphne for her hard work, her good work, and above all to Amy, Dr. Amy Elman, who's once again has taught us a great deal. The connections that, Amy, that you make are eye-opening, enlightening, troubling. But I, for one, am deeply grateful for having once again learned from you. Daphne, do you have a closing word?
No.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Amy and David. Amazing lecture, greatly convened. We'll be having another lecture in approximately 2 weeks. I'll be sending out mail and the recording with the PowerPoint to everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.